Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining the Column EDC Coffee Chat, Coffee with Colleen. We are really pleased to have our friend and lobbyist of the North Olympic Legislative Alliance, Josh Weiss, join us this morning to give us an update as to what's happening in Olympia during this 105-day session. So if you guys will keep yourself on mute, I'd appreciate that so we don't pick up background noises. And if you have any questions, we'd like this to be interactive. So go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to ask Josh, and we'll call on you, or alternatively, you can put your question in the chat. So with that, Josh, please take it away. And thank you for joining us.
Sure. Thank you, Colleen. Nice to be here and good to see everybody and some old friends on the call. Mike Doherty, Jeannie Beckett, Randy Johnson, Jim McIntyre. Lots of familiar faces. Nice to see you this morning. So we are about noon today. We'll officially be halfway through legislative session. Today's 52, day 52. There's 53 days left. Um, they're considering just about 1,900 bills, which is a lot. Um, we'll be on the floor, the House and the Senate are on the floor until March 12th, which, from just a steps in the process perspective, March 12th will actually be the halfway point for the process. So they've moved bills out of their policy committees, out of fiscal committees if they went to fiscal committees, and now they're being considered by the entire chamber. And so I've used this analogy, I think probably with this group
Read
before. It's like a
in the front.
like a big funnel process. Starts out with a lot of stuff getting poured in at the end, and it sort of slowly narrows down through time. I think for a lot of us, it doesn't narrow down quite as much as we would like. There's still lots of silliness going on out there. So far, I would say it's been a fairly not too controversial of a session. I think it's about to change as the emphasis shifts to the discussion of the budgets. So that's going to start here pretty soon. March 18th is the State Economic and Revenue Forecast Council meeting where publicly they will provide the revenue forecast for the next 4 years that the budgets will be based upon. Everybody has heard at this point that revenues are not growing as fast as expenditures are planned to grow. That has led, you may have seen last week, Governor Ferguson came out with a list of budget reductions that would be for the 4 year by the two biennia that they're required by state law to plan for. Governor Ferguson's reductions were an additional $4 billion on top of the $3 billion that Governor Inslee proposed. So a total of $7 billion in reductions proposed so far from the executive branch. And just to be clear, these are proposals. The legislature ultimately will make the decision about their own proposals that they will then forward to the Governor Ferguson for consideration. And what we saw from Governor Inslee was a complete budget package, if you will. It included proposals for capital, transportation, operating budgets. It included reductions, but it also, if you remember back to December, it was based upon really significant assumption about the amount of revenue that they could gain from a new wealth tax. That I think has been pretty quickly, I think was quickly derided. Maybe that's the quite right way to say it. Governor Ferguson came in, said he doesn't think taxes are the starting point. We need to do everything we can with reductions. And so, that's where we get to sort of that $7 billion proposal in what could be reduced. That is likely not to be a big enough set of reductions. And it's been interesting the last, I would say 2 weeks, probably maybe week, the debate that has reopened about the size of the hole. Um, so usually by this point in session, I would say there's pretty bipartisan agreement about what the target is, both in terms of how much they have to spend and if there's a problem, how big the hole is they have to spend. Last fall, we started hearing 6 billion. When Governor Inslee came out with his, it was in the realm of 12 billion. Last week, we started hearing 15 billion, and that was the size of the hole that Governor Ferguson mentioned. So I actually am very curious to better understand why there can be this much debate at this point about the size of the problem. So again,
So
that's an
with,
interesting development
yeah.
in the session. Go
So
ahead.
on that issue, when they're talking 6 billion or 12 or 15 or whatever the numbers are, is that for the 2-year biennium or are they talking 4-year?
That's for the 4-year budget
Bring my
outlook.
boxes home.
Oops,
What?
sorry.
You're gonna bring my boxes home.
Yes, that's fine.
Sorry. Let
Thanks,
me
babe.
get that muted. There we go.
Um,
So, and now last biennium's budget was 70 billion. Was that right?
just about. Yep.
70 billion. And so are they also including the 4 billion increase for state employee pay raises and then saying based on 74 billion, now we have to make the cuts of, okay, because yeah,
That
it is very confusing.
That is some of the debate. And that really explained kind of the discrepancy this last fall when we were hearing the difference between 7 billion versus 12 billion. Was Republicans were not including in their lower number the assumption that the collective bargaining agreements that OFM had come to with the state employee unions would be included, because technically that is a discretionary expenditure item. The legislature does not have to fund that. Typically they do. So that explains kind of the difference between 6 billion and 12 billion. But I haven't heard a good explanation. I haven't had a chance to ask anybody either, really, about the difference between 12 billion and 15 billion.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's over a 4-year period. I think I said that.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, so we also saw actually before Governor Ferguson put out his cut list, and my point with that is we still haven't seen Governor Ferguson come out with a complete budget package, right? So we've gotten lists of reductions, we've gotten ideas from him about where he would preserve funds, but it's not like a complete, here's how much money would go in each agency and each program. We will see those proposals from the legislature, from the House and the Senate, probably around the 19th, 20th, 21st of this month. Go ahead, Michael, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I just want to loop back real quick on the size of the hole. Are the projections taking into account either in the past or maybe this recent update the potential impact of tariffs on since we're so heavily dependent on trade, or will that further deepen the hole if our economy's negatively impacted by tariffs?
That's a really good question. So the State Economic and Revenue Forecast Council, they are basically our state economic forecasters. They will be they're looking at that right now. If you have any interest in this, it's kind of nerdy, but I think it's kind of cool. That meeting will be live streamed on TVW on March 18th. I think it's at 2 p.m. And they'll talk about sort of all the assumptions, and they put out a press release and they put out a report as well about all the assumptions that go into their forecast. I have not, in the time that I've been paying attention to these things, I've never quite seen them deal with tariffs or trade war like this. They have, they do their best during the Great Recession. They do their best to sort of try and predict what's going on overall in the national economy. And they talk about all the different sources they use. And they do their best, like in COVID, they tried to predict sort of what the economic impacts would be at the state level and national level. They're only forecasts. And that's a little bit of the root of the issue that we have right now with this so-called budget hole, is really just based on the assumptions that they used when they wrote the budget 2 years ago. And if you've ever looked at economic forecast or any kind of forecast, right, they usually give you a range between low probability, middle probability, high probability. The legislature this last biennium used sort of the high probability amount of revenue. And that will be the same case with risk, right? They'll assess sort of low, medium, high risk levels, and they'll just have to make a decision about how, their best guess about what the impact of tariffs will be. But luckily, there's experts that really understand these things. Get it as close as they can. And Colleen, you made the point earlier, this was, I think, implied in your past question, about state revenue still going up. I had actually just heard on the radio, I didn't look this up. I think Lindsay just put in the chat, there's probably a good explanation in the link he included, how much revenues are projected to still be going up this next biennium. Revenues are still increasing. We're not in a situation like the Great Recession in 2010, 2011, where, there were questions about the fundamentals of the national economy and the real estate market was crashing. And we had serious economic problems. That may be changing now, actually, with the tariffs. Hard to say, but I guess my point is, to your point, Colleen, just that revenues are still growing. It's just that our expenditures are projected to grow faster. Some of that's inflation, some of that is other things that you're seeing, and some of that's just the legislature decided to spend on new programs. So Ferguson came out with his cut list last week. The Democrats put out middle of last week, actually before Governor Ferguson, their list of what an all cuts budget would look like. They're clearly, Colleen, you asked me this before the recording started, there's clearly movement now to sort of demonstrate how bad things will be if the budget does not include any new revenue. Part of that effort was Democrats put out a website that was based on Governor Inslee's no cuts budget. Governor Inslee was required by law to put out a known revenue budget, as well as the thing that we all paid attention to in the fall was the Book 2 budget, what they call Book 2 budget, which includes new revenue. So Democrats put out the Book 1 budget and would be all cuts. It was $3.5 billion reductions in healthcare, $1.5 billion in human services, $365 million in behavioral health, and $375 million in corrections. So, you're starting to see, again, just that kind of idea of positioning, making sure people are aware of these are sort of the consequences. On the other side of that, we saw last fall, we know in particularly, well, I would say House and Senate Democrats have been thinking about new revenue options for quite some time. Last fall, there was sort of a mistake. The lead Senate revenue legislator mistakenly put out a list of the different revenue options that they were thinking about. Basically, we don't know what is on the table for real at this point. I mentioned before, Governor Inslee put out the idea of a wealth tax. I think a lot of folks have really sort of poked holes in that with the idea that if you do a wealth tax, it's really only a handful of individuals, depending on what size you tax at. It's pretty easy for those individuals to avoid those taxes. Thanks, Lindsay. I appreciate all the great chats you're putting in there. Good information for me to back me up. So I think the wealth tax is, I don't know, feels pretty unlikely to me. We are seeing lots of what I would consider sort of smaller proposals, if you will, out on the table right now. There was a couple of REIT proposals, a graduated REIT for local governments. Some of those bills are already out there, but we haven't seen, I don't think, what the real revenue proposals will be. They are talking about lifting the 1% property tax cap, which applies not only to local governments, but also to the state themselves. And I think part of the reason that they are talking about this for real is that education funding is one of the major topics of the session. They know they need to raise education funding. Most of the revenue that the state directs towards education funding is from the state portion of the property tax. Back when they did the McCleary fix, one of the things they did was, for a matter of, I think it was 4 years, they suspended the 1% property tax on the state portion. And I think they're going to have to do that again this year for themselves. And there's been discussions about doing that at the same time for locals. We heard a rumor yesterday that we won't see sort of the actual revenue proposals until maybe the week before sine die, that they'll put out a cuts budget, both the House and the Senate, in mid-March, let that sit around for a month. End of session is April 27th, and then come out at the very end when they're moving the budgets with whatever proposals they come forward with. So I think there's a lot of nervousness if you're for all of us, taxpayers, primarily for businesses, about sort of what they're going to do at the end. So other than the budgets, I was going to talk about 4 issues. But let me stop there again and just see if there's questions about the budget dynamics in the operating budget in particular, and revenue, and just where they're at. This is really the big issue of the session. Okay, I'll just
have questions?
I'll just keep rolling, and if people do, please put your hand up. I'm happy to rewind.
So this year, budget is more of a topic than housing. It seems like, housing dominates things as well, but more so budget this year.
But like so many other things, you can't talk about housing without talking about the budget.
Yeah.
They are continuing to put forward local mandate types of legislation that are intended to try and create the environment within the urban areas to build more housing. But that has been a theme for the last 4 years at least. And usually those proposals don't cost as much money. Like now they're considering a piece of legislation this year that would prohibit cities from requiring parking with new developments, right? So the idea that you're not tying up as much land with parking, you're allowing more land for actual development of housing, and again, that idea of densifying and trying to get urban mass transit in for those types of developments. So, and that's a weird issue where you've got the sort of urban, what I'll call urban left density proponents. Sorry if I offended anybody with that categorization, aligned with the builders and the realtors and the people that like to build and sell homes. So it's kind of weird politics in that. Commissioner Johnson, how can I answer your question?
Who knows if you're going to be able to answer it or not? So, so you talked about the tax side. Back to the budget, major cuts are also going to have to take place, I would think, to make things match. What kinds of cuts are we talking about? I mean, I've seen some very ominous kinds of things coming forward, and since you're very close to it, I'm just, whether it's my Olympic Area Agency on Aging kinds of issues, or a whole bunch of things on the medical side, et cetera. So, where do you think they're going to be going? So.
Yeah, it's a great question, Commissioner, and you're right. I can't answer that because I don't think anybody really knows. I think the best indicator we have are from the lists that the outgoing governor and current governor have put forward. I think Ferguson's list is probably pretty real. And, you know, and I think you're right. I should have said this earlier, that the proposal that comes forward will include a combination. I don't think they can raise $15 billion in revenue. I just think even in blue leaning Washington, I don't think that goes over well. But they've gotten, you know, like I said, $7 billion in reduction proposals. Can they come up with another 6? That's a lot more manageable or doable. Manageable, I don't know, a lot more doable. So I would go and look at what Ferguson has proposed. And he has, that press conference he did last week, I thought was really very interesting. If this is of interest to anybody, it's worth watching. You know, his philosophy was essentially he went back and looked at new spending increases over the last 2 biennia and used that as the baseline of, okay, well, those are new additions. They must not be sort of the base or base priority. He's clearly, Governor Inslee didn't cut any from public safety. Governor Ferguson has come out from the beginning and said he's not cutting any from public safety. And there's actually increases there. So I think a lot of it will land on healthcare. And some of those have pretty significant impacts. Colleen mentioned before we started the recording, the cuts to the association development organizations. We saw that happen in the Great Recession. I think that is something to be concerned about. Jim?
Unmute myself there. Good morning, Josh. Good insights. One other nerdy consideration here is Ferguson's insistence on the legislature and himself not using the most optimistic revenue projection for the next 4 years. That is a significant constraint on spending growth. If he's successful in getting the legislature to agree with that, that's gonna leave a mark, I think. So yeah. It's just something, one of these nerdy budget things to kind of think about.
Jim, that is like grade A nerdy budget nerdiness there. Good job.
I freely admit to being a budget nerd.
It's pretty fascinating stuff. But I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you. So I mentioned before public safety funding. That is one of the top 4 issues I'll mention to you. Just this turnaround of the legislature in the last really even 2 years on public safety is just fascinating. And, you know, I think I will admit I was one of the skeptics when the campaign was going on, when Governor Ferguson was saying he wanted to provide $100 million for local law enforcement officers. And he came in, you know, opening speech to the legislature and doubled down on that. And every conversation since then, he's continued to just say that he's not signing a budget that doesn't have at least $100 million in new funding for local law enforcement. There's now, I think, only 3 bills out there that would implement this in some way, but there were, as of even just a week ago, there were 6 or more. So the legislature really jumped on this and has lots of ideas about how to do it. It's pretty clear that they don't have like a consensus path forward on how they're going to do this. So this is one area that will be really fascinating to see at the end of the day how it shapes up. The governor really has said he's got in his opening speech to the legislature, he endorsed a Republican bill from Senator Holy from the east side of the state that would simply provide $100 million in grants to local governments from the state general fund. It would be one-time money intended for like short term. I think it's a maximum of 36 months. And their theory is, they've heard from local governments that it's hard to pay for those law enforcement officers, new hires of law enforcement officers while they're getting through the Criminal Justice Training Commission, which usually takes a couple of years to get a spot for an officer and then get them through the training. So basically they're saying, here, we'll pay for the training, we'll pay for the time it takes to get them through. We just want to incentivize you to hire new people. That has been criticized, I think, appropriately as being, just a short-term kind of fix. There are two other proposals out there that one has a combination of additional grants as well as some local option revenue sources that cities and counties can both use to pay for existing officers, existing services that would be long-term and more sustainable. And also include a grant. And then there's one proposal that's just a local option revenue source. So, again, I think this will be one of the areas to be really fascinating to see where they can get a majority, to support. The other area that is really big, I mentioned before a little bit too, is just education funding. The legislature, this is one other area where the legislature seems very intent on spending additional money above the baseline. There are three bills moving forward, what they're calling in the education world the big three. I am sorry, I don't know, and I forgot to look up the total cost that these would be. But one would significantly increase the amount of money that the state gives to local districts for what they call MSOC, materials, supplies, and something else.
Operating costs?
Thank you. Operating costs. Appreciate that. I should have phoned a friend, but I didn't need to. And then the third one has to do with transportation for kids, increasing the amount that districts get to transport kids. And then the third one is the amount that is paid for special education. I'm not an
We've
education.
been hearing a lot about special education funding.
Yep. And from what I've heard from limited conversations I have with local districts, it really sounds like the special education one could be a real significant increase for local districts. Yeah, so that'll be an area too where it'll be fascinating to see sort of how they end the session on this. The third big one is in the transportation budget, actually, as a sort of separate budget and separate from the whole prior budget conversation we've had. Totally different situation, the transportation budget. It is not a spending problem. It is a revenue problem. Our revenues are actually decreasing year over year because we are buying less gas. Transportation budget traditionally has been funded by gas tax. With electric cars and more fuel efficient cars, that is decreasing over time in real terms. And the other massive thing that's going on in transportation, like so many other sectors, is just inflation. The cost of these projects that they budgeted, the transportation budget, when they do a revenue package, they'll include a group of projects that they plan out for 20, 30 years in some cases. So the problem with the last two packages that they've done is just that the cost has so far exceeded what they planned for those, that they don't have the money to pay for even projects that they were expecting to do in the short term, let alone 20 years, 30 years out. And this is when, Jim, this is a nerdy budget point too. It's sort of fascinating to me that they haven't, in the transportation budget world, figured out a better way to estimate what they will need to account for inflationary pressures. I mean, I know you can only predict inflation. You don't know what it's going to be, but it just seems like it's not a very good system that they have now in place.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jim.
Yeah, no, my own guess is that inflation is going to be kind of sticky. It's not going to decrease as fast as it rose.
Absolutely.
So that'll leave a mark too.
That's right. That's right. Last week, on Thursday, both the House and the Senate Transportation Committees um, held work sessions where they just had nonpartisan staff come forward and provide a really basic overview of the shape of the transportation budgets. That's, again, if you're interested in this area, that's a good, it was an interesting set of presentations. They were a little different on the House and the Senate side. They are clearly also preparing, similar to the operating budget, to get people ready to have a conversation about transportation revenue. Carol, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Josh. When you think about those projects short term, do we have a sense of the prioritization of which ones would be prioritized for cuts first versus the revenue package positioning that you're talking about?
We have, we went through a somewhat similar exercise a couple of years ago before they did the last revenue package, the Move Ahead Washington package. And we know that then sort of their filter was, where do they have funds already committed, contracts in place, or ground broken, I think is probably even more relevant. They place a priority on where there's fish culverts involved. So they want to double up their court mandate to replace the culverts with any road projects where they can. And increasingly, I would say this is probably new, the focus is on road safety. The numbers in road safety for the state have gotten worse in the last few years. They're very concerned about road safety. In fact, I don't remember if it was the House or the Senate. I'm sorry. This year, I think it was the Senate. If you were going to put in a request for new transportation funding, you had to explicitly say how it would benefit road safety. They weren't taking any other types of projects.
I have a quick follow-up question to that.
Yeah.
I went to a recent TIPS meeting last night at a local level in the Kitsap County area. Would the Puget Sound Regional Council, who's asking for these surveys on road safety at each community around each county, who has the best voice for road safety for Clallam as it relates to these prioritizations of those projects? Is it the regional council that they're funneling some of these survey results in from the TIP programs, or is it more aligned with the different strategy?
I mean, I guess I have seen legislators be receptive to information that entities have submitted that is simply based on local traffic, local accident counts.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily have to come through your
Process.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all compelling, right? But I don't feel like there's an official
It just
process.
seems like the UGAs seem to get more attention, and then the rural communities get put aside, and we're paying taxes too. So just making sure that the prioritizations are there for our safety in Clallam.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's a good point. So I sort of left off saying that they're trying to get ready for a transportation revenue conversation as well. I think it will be similar to the operating conversation where it's a combination of either cuts of existing projects, delays of existing projects, as well as, how much money can they get support to raise. I think that could happen in a couple of different ways. What they often do, and probably part of the package regardless, will be an increase in fees and license rates, those types of things that they can raise statutorily. That obviously is not a big enough pot of money to really do anything that significant. So I think they'll also be having a conversation around the road usage charge. I think if you've heard me talk about this before, my feeling on that is that it's getting more and more real each year. The legislature talks about it. I know that my impression is that anytime I talk with people that I think the residents of the state are not nearly as um, ready to talk about this as I think the Transportation Committee, or sorry, the Joint Transportation Committee, JTC, that has done just an incredible amount of work in analysis of this over years. I think they actually have a fairly well-baked idea of how this could work. And it's based on years of analysis and some testing and, thinking about it. But it's pretty obvious that the residents of the state just aren't there. We're not caught up, right? So there's a bill out there. There's House and Senate bills out there. Word on the street is sort of that the House is a lot more interested in this than the Senate. But we'll really have to see. And then the other question with the road usage charge is how much of that do they count new revenue that they raise with something like that? Do they count as backfilling for gas tax loss versus in addition to gas tax? And that's a policy assumption that they can make, and they'll have to make that balance. The last issue I would flag, which is not, I would say not a big issue in the legislature, but I think would be of interest for Clallam County, is conversation that's happening, and it is conversational only this session, and pick up from last year as well, about how to generate revenue from state trust lands, and whether or not timber harvest will continue to be the one as viable a revenue source as it has been in the past, even with all the recent controversy, but also whether or not the state legislature approves some sort of method to try and generate money from what they call ecosystem services from these lands. We saw a bill 2 years ago come forward at the request of the Commissioner of Public Lands that caused a huge legislative fight, did not pass, that would have allowed DNR to enter into some markets for ecosystem services. So basically the idea being that you're not going to be logging these lands, you're going to be tapping into other markets. I think they were thinking the carbon market when they originally put the bill forward. There's a work session tomorrow in the House Natural Resources Committee. Actually, it's a hearing on a bill. It's not a work session, but there's no intent to move the bill forward. It is a conversation piece to keep people engaged in this. I would anticipate more work coming over the interim. I think the legislature is interested in this. I think the new Commissioner of Public Lands is interested in this. It's, I think, coming soon to a theater near you. So something to pay attention to. So I think the last thing that I'll say is more than any other session that I've seen, it feels to me like there is this sword hanging over our head, which is the federal government. And, it came out a couple of weeks ago that the estimate was that Washington gets 30% of its resources from federal sources. We don't have a budget deal at the federal level yet. We keep hearing that there's Medicare, Medicaid cuts coming. If that happens, I know that the executive branch and legislative branches here have been having conversations about how to react, both in terms of, we're seeing obviously the litigation, but in terms of preparation, what happens if we receive less money? That could upend everything at the very last minute. I think I have not looked this up, so don't quote me on this, but somebody had told me that the continuing resolution or new budget needs to be in place by the end of this month. Federally, I see a nod. Thank you. That would be a month away from the end of our session. So hopefully, hopefully that doesn't happen, but it could really, really put all of our best laid plans to naught. I think my sense, talking about all of these policy proposals, the 1900 bills, the legislature, lots of new legislators have lots of really good ideas that they're trying to get through, and we're starting to see them hit the wall budgetarily here. Anything that costs money is getting very significant scrutiny. I think that will continue. That pressure will increase. Oh, thank you, Jeannie. Continuing resolution expires on the 14th or 15th. I lost my train of thought. Sorry, just that things could change here on a dime, and we're all sort of waiting to see. Oh, that's a good question. How much is in the state's rainy day fund? This is off of the cuff. It's usually a couple of billion. I would need to look at the last balance sheet from Governor Inslee's budget to get that exactly right. They have been spending money out of the rainy day fund, although they are still they're required to put a certain amount into the rainy day fund, and they have always met that obligation. Yes, so they're meeting that responsibility. There's a question about
I'll ask, yeah. What is the status of housing related legislation, including the proposal to cap rental increases and anything related to capital projects for the North Olympic Peninsula?
I can't answer, sorry, about capital projects for North Olympic Peninsula. With Representative Theringer as the chair of the committee, North Peninsula has always done great in the capital budget. I would expect the same. The capital budget's in relatively good shape. And I think it'll be pretty much a traditional capital budget year because it's primarily funded with bonds. That's the answer to Jeannie's question. And we'll see that in 2 weeks. On the housing, like the rent cap increase, that bill is still alive. Legislators seem pretty committed to it. The majority seems pretty committed to it. The dynamic from last session in the Senate, where the more moderate Democrats were able to kill that proposal, I think has changed. So I would not be surprised at all if that's something that they do this session. Jeannie, did I get to everything you wanted on the capital budget?
Yes, thank you.
So we've got some hands raised. Jeannie, did you have a follow-on?
No, I was just curious about the capital budget in general. Thank you.
Got it. Okay, Jim?
Another nerd comment about the capital budget. The bonds are paid for out of the general fund. So if there's an alignment of stars and planets with a very late federal action on the rest of fiscal 2025 spending, and that involves significant cuts in federal funding to states. So there's two ifs there. One source of money to backfill some lack of federal money is the expenditure amount for paying off the capital budget bonds. So the capital budget isn't really all that safe. If those ifs come to pass, the capital budget necessarily isn't all that safe from, being significantly affected here. So, and this is such a jump ball kind of year budget wise. It's hard to imagine, but planning for the worst is probably more important this year than it has been in past years. So.
Yeah, that's an astute observation. Even with the quote unquote problems that we have in the operating budget as we currently understand them, there's enough revenue capacity to pay for increased bonds. to have a relatively healthy capital budget. But you're right, if you start moving out significant amounts of money from the federal government, you quickly run into that problem.
Yeah.
And that could complicate things significantly.
Yeah, really.
Tim?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Josh. I'm Clallam County Housing and Grant Resource Director. You know, I've seen a lot. Director Fong's budget had $100 million in it for CHIP funding in the capital, and it had 1.2 is what he was requesting for Housing Trust Fund for the next biennium. Are those moving through, or is Director Nguyen, is he changing that? Do you know where those are at?
I don't know where the new director's at. And we haven't seen legislative proposals yet. What I would say is that housing very much is a priority still for the legislature. I think to the degree, and I know the majority very much feels like the Housing Trust Fund in particular is part of the solution for the, housing problem we have in the state. I think that will be one of the last things that they look towards. But, depending on where we're at, who knows what the scenario is.
Okay, because I've watched a lot of both the Senate and the House Housing Committees and seeing how bills are moving through, seeing the RV bill move through 1443 and the rent stabilization bill move through. And if they move through the full body sessions like they did through the committees, I think both of those are getting through.
Yeah.
What's the RV bill about, Tim or Josh?
The RV bill requires the cities and counties allow at least one RV per property, at least one RV. And the only thing the city and county can do is to oversee whether the hookups are properly. They can't inspect the vehicle or anything along that line. So there's some serious questions involved with the RV bill from safety perspectives and those sort of things. But, that they're looking and they're going, okay, that, what, $10,000 for an RV, that's a livable unit for somebody. And that's what they're going to mandate through. And like I say, that it'll turn residential neighborhoods, could turn them into RV parks as long as they can meet the side setbacks. And I was really surprised that King County and legislators from there would be pushing that along like they are. That kind of surprised me moving forward.
But if the homeowners association prohibits RVs openly parked, does that override the bill?
Yeah.
In HOA communities, but a lot of this is going to be city residential communities that don't have. And people are going to look at this that, if I can get $800 to $1,000 a month as renting out a spot, they're going to do it. I mean, we're seeing it through the county, through Clallam County Rental, where they're, renting RV spaces, renting RVs, that sort of thing. And they're getting good money for them.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions for Josh? Or Josh, do you have you said your last item, but do you have anything else you wanted to share? We got 9 more minutes.
Make it good news, please.
I'm looking for some. I'm looking for some.
Yeah, it's a tough year with the federal and state cuts.
Some good news. I think I shared this with the EDC board last week, so this won't be new, but for Commissioner Johnson, for those of you in the veterans community that have really worked hard to try and separate the county veteran levy from the general levy at, House Bill 1102, I think it's moving forward, and I have never seen it get this far. So maybe there's going to be some small ball good news. That's what I would say.
Josh, just so you know, we got it through the House one time and it died in the Senate. So
Thank you.
All right.
I don't really have anything, massive I'm looking at my bill list here that's either good news or really all that significant to mention.
Any news from either Matt Hewish or Josh about the Simdars interchange and where that's going to fall on the transportation list?
I
Don't
don't have
know.
any information.
Matt, do you? He's still on. May not be. Yeah, he is. We'll have to find out how that's coming along.
I think it will depend. I'm not sure you guys would know. How far along is the project?
Well, I believe WASDOT was working on the designs, but I could be incorrect.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're doing a
All
lot
right.
of clearing down on that area, so I don't know quite what's going on there, but I was wondering if Matt did, because like I say, they're doing on that intersection right there where you come, if you're headed west and you come off, they're clearing both sides of that corner out, so.
I like Micah's positive, getting his 7 p.m. sunset soon. That's good. Keep it in perspective.
That's right. We live in a beautiful place. Hopefully you've got great people in your family.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we sure appreciate you, Josh, representing our concerns and our perspectives in Olympia. I know it's a wild time. I sure am glad I'm not a legislator. I wouldn't enjoy doing it right now, that's for sure. It's tough work and they don't get paid well.
No.
And it really, if you're doing the job right, it's a full-time job. You don't have another job. So, and that's the case with our 3 legislators now. So, you gotta consider that.
Yep.
Well, everyone, Josh, if you don't have anything else.
I was going to say one other
yeah.
thing. Sorry. I'm not sure
Great,
if this is
good.
politically appropriate, but I don't mean it as a political statement, but really, Adam Birnbaum is doing a really good job as a freshman legislator. Of course, Senator Chapman and Representative Theringer are always stable and consistent for us, but it's nice. It's just good to see Representative Birnbaum up here and working hard, and he's got a good attitude and he's getting people's respect, and it's cool to see.
Yeah. And he was the legislative assistant for Theringer, so he certainly knew the system and everything, and so had a leg up compared to other freshman representatives.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
it is evident.
Okay. Yeah. And a PhD in political science.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. So definitely has a passion and an interest in it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week, hopefully, and have a great day and a great week.
Bye,
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye, Josh. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.